All right, thank you for joining me for the second ACT prep reading for the things they carried. This time I will not be reading, but we're going to be using the audiobook narrated by Bryan Cranston. This audiobook was purchased from Audible for the purpose of using for this selection, for this short selection of the text. There'll be 4 selections from this text that we'll be going through. I read the first one. This one will be Bryan Cranston. To complete this extra credit, you're going to be, as we read, highlighting the selection in bold and adding a comment with the correct answer. That will be an A, B, C, or D, or an E if there's that many options. And that is how you will be completing this assignment. I'm going to pause after the sections that have questions, and I'm going to give the answer. For the first 7, I'm going to explain why that answer is correct. And I'm going to explain why the other answers are incorrect. And then from then on, we're just going to do the correct answers. The goal of this is to prep for the ACT, and it's not meant to be a gotcha. It's meant to be more of a discussion of why these answers are correct and how you should be thinking about these questions while you're reading the ACT. All right, let's go ahead and get into the reading. Thank you again for joining us.
Love. Many years after the war, Jimmy Cross came to visit me at my home in Massachusetts, and for a full day we drank coffee and smoked cigarettes and talked about everything we had seen and done so long ago, all the things we still carried through our lives. Spread out across the kitchen table were maybe 100 old photographs. There were pictures of Rat Kiley and Kiowa and Mitchell Sanders, all of us, the faces incredibly soft and young. At one point, I remember, we paused over a snapshot of Ted Lavender, and after a while Jimmy rubbed his eyes and said he'd never forgiven himself for Lavender's death. It was something that would never go away, he said quietly, and I nodded and I told him I felt the same about certain things. Then for a long time neither of us could think of much to say.
All right, so our first question is on that passage. Our question is, Tim O'Brien's purpose in this paragraph is most likely to, and then we have to choose between these selections. The correct answer is C, because there is evidence of friends hanging out in this section. A is incorrect because there's only one mention of negative experience. B is incorrect because there is no evidence of leaving bad memories behind. And D is incorrect because there is, in fact, evidence of C.
The thing to do, we decided, was to forget the coffee and switch to gin, which improved the mood, and not much later we were laughing about some of the craziness that used to go on. The way Henry Dobbins carried his girlfriend's pantyhose around his neck like a comforter, Kiowa's moccasins and hunting hatchet, Rat Kiley's comic books. By midnight we were both a little high, and I decided there was no harm in asking about Martha. I'm not sure how I phrased it, just a general question. But Jimmy Cross looked up in surprise. "You writer types," he said. "You got long memories." Then he smiled and excused himself and went up to the guest room and came back with a small framed photograph. It was the volleyball shot. Martha bent horizontal to the floor, reaching, the palms of her hands in sharp focus. "Remember this?" he said. I nodded and told him I was surprised. I thought he'd burned it.
All right, so for this question, the correct answer is B. The question mark needs to go inside the question. It is not A because a change is needed. It is not C because the question mark doesn't go at the end of the sentence. And it is not D because the exclamation mark does not make sense in context.
Jimmy kept smiling. For a while he stared down at the photograph, his eyes very bright. And then he shrugged and said, "Well, I did. I burned it. After Lavender died, I couldn't. This is a new one. Martha gave it to me herself." They'd run into each other, he said, at a college reunion in 1979. Nothing had changed. He still loved her. For 8 or 9 hours, he said, they spent most of their time together. There was a banquet, and then a dance, and then afterward they took a walk across the campus and talked about their lives. Martha was a Lutheran missionary now, a trained nurse, although nursing wasn't the point, and she had done service in Ethiopia and Guatemala and Mexico. She had never married, she said, and probably never would. She didn't know why, But as she said this, her eyes seemed to slide sideways, and it occurred to him that there were things about her he would never know. Her eyes were gray and neutral. Later, when he took her hand, there was no pressure in return. And later still, when he told her he still loved her, she kept walking and didn't answer, and then after several minutes looked at her wristwatch and said it was getting late. He walked her back to the dormitory. For a few moments he considered asking her to his room, but instead he laughed and told her how back in college he had almost done something very brave. It was after seeing Bonnie and Clyde, he said, and on this same spot he'd almost picked her up and carried her to his room and tied her to the bed and put his hand on her knee and just held her there all night long. It came close, he told her. He'd almost done it. Martha shut her eyes. She crossed her arms at her chest, as if suddenly cold, rocking slightly. Then after a time she looked at him and said she was glad he hadn't tried it. She didn't understand how men could do those things. What things? He asked. And Martha said, the things men do. Then he nodded. It began to form. Oh, he said, those things. At breakfast the next morning, she told him she was sorry. She explained there was nothing she could do about it, and he said he understood. And then she laughed and gave him the picture and told him not to burn this one up. Jimmy shook his head. It doesn't matter, he finally said. I love her. For the rest of his visit, I steered the conversation away from Martha. At the end, though, as we were walking out to his car, I told him that I'd like to write a story about some of this.
All right, so for question number 3, the answer is A, no change. It's worth noting when you're taking the ACT that on questions that give you the option of no change will be the correct answer 25% of the time on your test. So if you always avoid no change, you are going to miss 25% of those questions. So just heads up, you will have to select no change sometimes to get the correct answer on those. It's not B because the comma needs to go inside the quotation marks. It's not C because the period should be a comma. And it's not D because there does need to be a comma in the sentence.
Jimmy thought it over and then gave me a little smile. Why not? He said. Maybe she'll read it and come begging. There's always hope, right? Right, I said. He got into his car and rolled down the window. Make me out to be a good guy, okay? Brave and handsome, all that stuff. Best platoon leader ever. He hesitated for a second. And do me a favor? Don't mention anything about... No, I said. I won't.
All right, for the last question in this first section, for question number 4, the correct answer is D. The best answer is that the character has been affected by his experience. A is incorrect because his pause does not necessarily indicate growth. B is the second best answer. C is there is not evidence of this in the passage, so there's not really evidence of what C is in the passage. And because D is an effective answer, it's not none of the above. All right, I'm going to stop this recording and I'm going to pick back up at spin.